Are you overwhelmed by the challenge of personalizing communication for thousands of students? That's where Element 451's AI assistants come in. From nudging prospective students to guiding those already on their journey, AI assistants don't just automate, they write, build, and optimize every step of your digital campaigns. Discover how at element451.com/AI team.
Welcome to Mastering the Next, a cutting-edge podcast that explores the future of graduate, online, and non-traditional education through the lens of AI and technology. I'm your host, Dr. Ray Lutsky, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Element 451. Join me for discussions with some of the thought leaders shaping the future of graduate enrollment management through technology. Mastering the Next is a part of the Enrollify Network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform that helps institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Colin Potts, Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Missouri University of Science and Technology. We'll delve into strategic planning at Missouri S&T, focusing on the growth of non-thesis master's programs and research-based PhD and MS programs, exploring how these initiatives are shaping the future of graduate education. Additionally, we'll discuss the broader implications of these strategies on graduate education at universities across the U.S. Dr. Potts, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
What's next for Missouri S&T graduate programs? Can you share some of the details and key components of your strategic plan?
Well, so we're looking at the landscape of higher education in general, of course, and particularly relevant to this discussion, graduate education. Our strategic plan starts from several what we call North Star goals, these kind of overarching goals. And one of them is related to enrollment and one is related to research stature and our presence in the research community. So we're aiming to increase our student population. We're a small to medium-sized university, or have been until quite recently, to 8,000 undergraduates and 4,000 graduate students, which is a shift to a 2-to-1 ratio. It's rather different from our history. So that's one thing. I can say a little bit more about that in a second. And the other is go from being an R2 university to an R1 university. And both of these goals, the numbers and the R1 classification, are really means to an end. The goal behind the goal in both cases is, first of all, to become more of a graduate-oriented university, not exclusively so. I mean, we're not turning our back on undergraduates, but we see in many areas that the graduate degree is the new bachelor's degree. But it's interesting because I think that when we talk about graduate students, we often assume that they're a homogeneous mass, but really there are two completely different, well, at least two different classifications of graduate students. And they require, I think, different strategies and different approaches. So there are the non-thesis and then there's the research-oriented students. We are going to be, we know, based on the Carnegie classifications and the way that they've reorganized and simplified their system for assessing universities, we're going to be an R1 university next year. And the key component of that going forward is going to be the number of PhD students that a university graduates every year. And so I think thinking about what is it that PhD students want, why do they want to do a PhD, not just from our point of view, but what does it take to recruit more students, particularly domestic students, into PhD programs is going to be a really important part of our enrollment strategy. And then there's the non-thesis master's programs, and how do we kind of distinguish those in terms of pedagogy and just our administrative strategy is going to be very important because we might talk about this later, but until quite recently, I think there's been very much a tradition here, like there are in many universities, of regarding graduate students essentially as PhD students, and master students are often an afterthought, and which is not good for them, and it's not good for us. And so that's something else which we're changing.
I want to unpack a lot of what you just shared, and I wanted to kind of dive into each piece of it, but let's stick with non-thesis master's programs for a second, and thinking that these are opportunities for professional growth. So how does the university assess market demand and industry needs when developing new graduate programs, specifically the non-thesis master's programs?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because we're not a supermarket, obviously, but we do depend on customers. And these are people who are making a real long-term investment in their future. And what's more, I think very often they're sponsored by companies, and we have to, even if they're not, we have to think about what are the employment prospects of students going forward who do graduate with graduate degrees, so that what we're offering is marketable. And I think the important thing, and it's kind of an unstated assumption in what you said, is that graduate students are very much more purposeful about their careers than undergraduate students traditionally have been, although even that's starting to change very much. And we're in a fairly rural location. Rolla is a small town, halfway between St. Louis and Springfield, Missouri, and we can't expect mid-career professionals to drop everything and come here for a year and a half to 2 years. I mean, we do have continuing bachelor students who want to remain and do a graduate degree here, and we have many international students. But we really have to think about population centres and kinds of degree programs that students will want to take that they can convert fairly directly into employment opportunities and improve their career. So we really use two sources of information. I think it's true to say. One is, we have access to a number of, professional databases and services that give us a read on what the market demand is. I will say that I don't know how much we can trust those about the future, particularly in rapid changing fields. I think. We don't want to be fighting the last war constantly, but this is a good source of information. It gets us outside of ourselves because, I'm a faculty member too. We always want to kind of dream up really great things that we would be interested in first and foremost. And the proof of the pudding, I think, is in the admissions. The second source of information is that we have very tight connections with a number of industrial partners. Part of our strategic plan, which I didn't mention, is really outreach to the community. We have a very active involvement with companies in Missouri and the region. We've got a number of public-private partnerships in applied research and technology transfer going on. We're just opening a public-private kind of building called the Protoplex to promote shared research in manufacturing, for example. So I think we're ahead of many universities in thinking of ourselves not just as people who work in, I wouldn't say an ivory tower, but an independent scholarly context, and then we seek to transfer the technology. It's much more incremental than that. And so as a part of that, we're able to interact with a number of companies. We have a board of trustees. They're called board of trustees. They're really a kind of an advisory board. Very influential senior, sometimes recently retired executives from major corporations. They usually have an association with S&T, either because they're alums or they have kids who are. And so they're very much predisposed to working with us, but at the same time, they hold us to account, and they're very realistic. I mean, for example, I was on vacation in Italy a few weeks ago, and interrupted it for a very fruitful 2-hour interchange with our board about our enrollment prospects, undergraduate and graduate. And it's a 365, 24/7 kind of interaction. And I think that they really have their finger on the pulse about what their companies are really interested in the future. And often I think, as academics, we think that, well, industry is very short term. They're talking about quarterly reports and so on. And whereas we have the long view, actually they can be very, very sophisticated, broadly with a broad view about what the future of their industry sectors are, and their insights are actually incredibly valuable.
That brings me to my next question, because as you mentioned, the master's degrees can sometimes be an afterthought. And congratulations that you're moving to the R1 status. That's a remarkable achievement. But it requires a balance between the growth of the non-thesis master's programs you're talking about with your research-based portfolio of graduate programs, PhD and MS programs. What are the benefits of that balance? What do you see as potential pitfalls or opportunities there?
I think that faculty members often conflate the term student to mean either an undergraduate student, which is our bread and butter. The general public impression of universities is full of 18 to 22-year-olds, and that'll always be our main business. Or they mean their students, PhD students, the people who work in their labs that they see every day, that they kind of cultivate and sometimes are frustrated by. And the master students are somewhat of an afterthought. And at my previous institution, we really rethought the computer science master's degree. And we were very frank when we started that activity that the master's degree was too much being treated as or master's students were being treated too much as cash cows, that they were a source of enrollment revenue that we rather took for granted, and they weren't really cultivated in the same way. They hadn't got anywhere to hang out because they weren't part of the research labs. We had all of these state-of-the-art buildings for undergraduates, but nothing for master's students. And so I think it does take that kind of separate thinking. So partly, I think it's a matter of faculty culture and an acceptance of the fact that the world is changing, and lifelong education, for example, is a really important theme that we have to take on board. I think another challenge is actually we also have to think. I mean, higher education in general has to start thinking about, well, what's the PhD as an institution, as a degree, really for? And I think during the really rapid growth of the university sector after the Second World War, but particularly the 70s and the 80s, the assumption was we needed lots of PhDs, and many of them would go into academic life as professors. And if not, then they'd be kind of quasi professors, but they'd be researchers, in think tanks, research labs, and so on. And I think that, with the exception maybe the pharmaceutical industry and some, really high-tech engineering fields, having a PhD degree doesn't really give you very much value added over and above the master's degree. And it might even be in some areas a prejudice that you're, quote, overqualified. And so I think many people now, particularly with fairly high employment and a rebounding economy, thinking twice about a very long-term commitment that they see, possibly correctly, as largely being a union card for an academic position, but not for very much else. And I think we, as a sector of society, we have to sort of think, well, what's a PhD really useful for, and how can we equip students who are not satisfied with a thesis master's, a non-thesis master's, to go into something which is more demanding and long-term and really personally rewarding, but also has other benefits. And that's why I think we're seeing a growth of in education, we're seeing the EDD, we're seeing the growth of DBAs above and beyond MBAs, and there are doctors of engineering which are more practically oriented. But I think we're really just scratching the surface of the possibilities there. And this is something that I'll freely admit we haven't really talked about here at S&T in a very deep way with detailed plans. But I think it's on the horizon. And I think that's something that faculty are likely to embrace.
Faculty buy-in is so critical to all of this, right? So on that point, how does Missouri S&T engage and support your faculty in the development and implementation of the strategic initiatives for graduate education that you're talking about? How have you engaged them?
Well, all graduate programs all programs, period, originate with the faculty. We can say we have a great opportunity in this area, but if faculty aren't really willing to pick up that ball and run with it and say, this is to supply the details, because they're the subject matter experts, obviously. we have an interactive approach for formulating and cultivating new degree programs. Another thing I'd say is that part of our general strategy here has been to identify a number of technology growth areas, call them research areas if you like, because they are really where we're planning to hire interdisciplinary faculty and grow our approach, grow larger research proposals for ERCs and these kinds of really quite large, high investment activities, and so that's having, I think, a follow-on, a knock-on effect. So, for example, we're highly involved. I mentioned it a little while ago in the area of manufacturing, which can obviously be very much. We're not talking about Pittsburgh, Cleveland kind of steel mills. We're talking about small, not artisanal, but highly specialized kind of manufacturing, including those involving new materials and chemical engineering. We're working in the areas of sustainability of energy and resources, everything that means. And that includes, for example, mining and reclamation of critical minerals. We're working in the area of intelligent and automated systems, AI, if you like, or the information economy in general, some work in cyber security, these kinds of things. And also the whole idea of the infrastructure. We have a very strong civil engineering department, which is, obviously we're not just talking about concrete here and bridges, but the infrastructure in general, safe water, the electricity grid, transportation. And so all of those fields are really directing our thoughts towards professional credentials, whether they're master's degrees or certificates or anything else. And, I don't think it's healthy to think of a university. I've never liked the multiversity idea. Universities really are, there's a sort of wholeness to a university, particularly one like ours with a rich history and set of traditions. And so if you're branching out in different areas, I think it's really important to keep them coordinated in some way. So we don't have one set of growth strategies for master's degrees and one set of growth strategies for research areas. And so to the extent that there's faculty buy-in in all of these things simultaneously, you can proceed on multiple fronts at the same time.
Hey, it's Mallory. Element 451 is hosting the AI Engage Summit on October 29th and 30th. This free virtual event brings together leaders, innovators, and many of your favorite Enrollify creators to explore AI's impact on student engagement, enrollment marketing, and institutional success. We're packing the schedule with real examples and case studies, so you leave knowing how to harness AI to drive meaningful change at your institution. Whether you're looking to enhance student outcomes, optimize enrollment marketing, or simply stay ahead of the curve, the AI Engage Summit is your gateway to the next level of higher education innovation. Registration is free. Visit element451.com to save your spot. Now, back to the show.
Kind of pulling back and thinking about a sort of a national or global view, with the growth of non-thesis master's programs all over the place, how do you see that influencing the overall research output and innovation coming from institutions? Is it having an impact?
Well, I think it follows from, I think, what we've just been talking about, because it's, you want to be very careful that they're synergistic, and I don't see any conflict in that sense. There is, in terms of subject matter, in terms of areas, in terms of the kinds of people we hire, the way we identify ourselves as as members of an institution. It does mean there are different ways of working, of course. I actually think it's in some ways more flexible. The more online students you have, the more flexible your time is as a teacher. You don't have to be in the same place Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m. If you're going to a conference, you can spend 3 days conference going, and do all your teaching at the weekend. And that's something that in-person teaching doesn't really make as possible. And the same thing's true, of course, of much lab research or archive research. There's some where you have to be there, to tend to your animals. But I think that as we move towards a more, I'm assuming, a more online presence for non-thesis master students, this gives us more flexibility with our time, and so that any overlap, any inconsistencies or conflict between these different missions, I think could be handled quite easily in that way. The other thing I'd say is that we're going from a ratio of, at the moment, I guess it's about 3 and a bit to 1 undergraduates to graduate students to our goal of 2 to 1. My previous institution, it started at 2 to 1. Well, when I say started, I mean when I first started to take notice of this as an administrator in about 2008, the ratio was 2 to 1. And that was not long before the creation of the rather famous or infamous online master's degree in computer science, which I think is the largest program in the world now. It graduates 10% of the computer science master's graduates in the country every year. Huge, very successful, and very well run. It's a very high quality degree program. And now, 15 years later, the ratio of undergraduates to graduate students is not 2 to 1 anymore. It's like 1 to 1.2. It's a predominantly graduate university. Now, I don't think that it's had any real effect on the research output or the way that the faculty regard their relationship with research and scholarship and their, subject matter. It really has had an independent, I think, effect on the prosperity of the institution. So I'm very optimistic that actually moving more into the non-thesis master's program, it will not disrupt the kind of normal ways that people have of working, the way they see themselves as scholars and, research professionals as well as teachers. But there is some skepticism about that, of course, because changes, particularly, if you had said at Georgia Tech, which was the institution I'm referring to, in 2007, we're about to embark on a strategy that will completely change the ratio of students on campus. And the majority of the new graduate students that we're talking about will be pursuing master's degrees and they'll be online. There would have been a riot. Everybody would have said, this is completely changing our status as a research university. And are you trying to make us a vocational school? And nothing could have been further from the truth. But I think looking into an uncertain future like that, it's quite natural for people to be a little bit skeptical. And I do encounter that in my role here to some extent too, but I really don't think it's warranted.
It's incredible to think of the growth of a program like that over time and how dominant it can be. And that really makes me think about recruitment and retention. For non-thesis programs or for research programs, retention can be an issue. It's very challenging for some students and requires a lot of finesse. So how do you look at that now at Missouri S&T? What strategies are you thinking about for the attraction and retention of your graduate students?
Well, I'll be quite honest. We do, I think, depend a little bit too much on international students, and not only that, but international students from one particular region, particularly India. We don't have as many Chinese students, but we have quite a few from the Middle East. And of course, trends being what they are, the visa backlogs, the potential for geopolitical events, it means that that pipeline is really vulnerable to things that are out of our control. And so we're looking to diversify. And that's one thing. Another is just in terms of the techniques that we use to recruit students. We've had enormous success over the past 2 years in undergraduate admissions. So they've gone up. Never mind about the demographic cliff. We're actually in really good shape in our undergraduate recruitment. And I would say, part of this, as you know, everybody, I think, realizes that undergraduate admissions is a little bit of a dark art. It's a huge kind of industry with all kinds of techniques and analytics that are used. And it's very, very professionalized. But at the same time, what we've done is, on top of a really exceptional, I think, enrollment management division, is we've got our academic departments very actively involved in the recruitment process, and particularly in the yield management process. And so department chairs and other faculty. Don't worry, I'm coming back to graduate education in a second. They're very involved with methods that make sense for them, for different departments. So some, for example, are sending personalized handwritten notes to students who are accepting, saying, we're so excited you're joining us in August. Is there anything we can do? Here's what. Some of them are sending swag of various kinds. Some are getting undergraduate students to perform in social media kind of clips to say how happy they are, these sorts of things. And what we haven't done yet is, in as concerted a way, is use analogous approaches for graduate students, and that's actually something that we're really doing right now. We're looking into what are the using kind of appreciative inquiry, what are the lessons that we've learned and the things that we can build on that we can't repeat. I mean, you're not going to visit high schools if you're in India, if you're recruiting graduate students there, but can we, for example, can we nudge faculty into a rewarding way of going to and making side trips when they go to conferences, for example, to local universities, to say, hey, come to S&T to be a graduate student. Little things like that really add up, and effort matters. I mean, none of these techniques is going to completely revolutionize what we do, but I think it'll have the effect of shifting the culture, and they will have some small demonstrable effects, each of them, which add up into quite a big effect overall. And that's what's happened with undergraduate enrollment. That's the other thing that is enrollment's all about. It's not just about admissions; it's also about retention. And we've looked at some ways that we could make our campus more of a destination of choice and a place that graduate students want to stay. I mean, I don't think anybody. It's not quite the case with non-thesis masters, but nobody completes a PhD without thinking, "What am I doing? I should drop everything and go and join the workforce." You always have these kinds of dark moments, and what we want to do is stop people from making that leap unless they really, really need to. I mean, it's something that is good for them. So we're putting a lot of effort into mental health and well-being, where again there's been a huge growth of interest in how you do that for undergraduate students. But I think our attention to graduate students, I don't just mean ours at S&T, I mean in the academic sector in general, has lagged behind. The graduate student body have drawn up a Bill of Rights, essentially, about their reasonable expectations about how they feel they should be treated, which we've worked with them on. And I have high hopes that'll be kind of accepted. And again, these statements of intent, I think, get enshrined in our culture and get implemented in various kinds of policies. And so that's something I'm excited that we'll be doing this semester.
It's a great model, and probably something that institutions will begin to emulate. And in the time we have left, use your crystal ball. Trends like that, what kinds of trends do you anticipate will shape the future of graduate education, and how are universities going to need to adapt to these trends? You mentioned mental health, you mentioned retention of PhD students. What other trends do you anticipate in the future?
So that's a really good question. I think the whole sort of thinking freshly about what doctoral degrees are. When I was in the state of Georgia, we had a system provost, essentially, a guy called Tristan Denley, who dreamt up a really great idea of a sort of alternative to the associate's degree that was more academically demanding than a tech diploma. And this was done in parallel with the creation of a number of non-campus academies that the system administered and were like a home for sort of internships and experiential education, a film academy, a fintech academy. And so the state of Georgia created this sort of parallel track to the associate's degree called a nexus degree. And I think the term was all to do with the fact that there were connections between industry and different areas and weren't beholden to academic fields that were traditionally defined. And I always thought that this was an idea that was implemented in the wrong way, in the wrong area. Not to criticize it, I think it was an intriguing idea, but we don't really think about graduate education in that kind of way. We have master's degrees, we have PhD degrees, and we shoehorn different kinds of ideas into these two structures. So we have different kinds of doctorates that aren't PhDs, and we have lots of different kinds of master's degrees, and we have graduate certificates. And are they really graduate diplomas? What makes them a certificate? And I think some kind of consolidation of these ideas, this credentialing. I mean, you can wave your hands all you like about badges and stackable credentials, and I think these, there were some good ideas here, but they've never really gelled into something that means something. And I think we need something that means something that isn't quite the same as a traditionally evolved master's program. And we don't really know what that is at the moment. And the experience in Georgia, I think, shows that you can't kind of do this thing unilaterally. There needs to be a critical mass, and it never caught on. But we need something that needs to catch on. And I think that can happen at the graduate level. The other thing I'll say is that, we're looking at, just societally, we're looking at, retirements that last for decades, and people who retire early, and a replacement of a kind of a career notion of that one's life course with a succession of projects. There's been a decline of loyalty between employers and employees. You don't get a pension and a gold watch anymore. So people are looking out for themselves. And that's going to reflect, I think, in lifelong education. Lifelong education isn't just going to mean a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and then maybe an evening course or two, or maybe you come back and do an MBA. It's going to mean really lifelong education. And I think we have to think about like subscription models of education, that you don't like pay for a diploma, or you pay for the education that leads to a diploma, but perhaps you kind of subscribe to educational experiences for the length of time that it suits you. It's something which is really taken on in the media industry, for example. You don't buy CDs anymore. You kind of sign up for a service. Those kinds of things, if they're implemented in a fresh way, I think are going to be really very, very influential in the future. And we're not really there yet. So those kinds of things, I think, I think we have to think outside the box more than we have been, clearly, because the public demands it, and there's a lot of skepticism about the future of higher education.
Dr. Colin Potts, Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Missouri University of Science and Technology, thanks for your time. The Mastering the Next podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea, and feature a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Artis Cadieux, J.C. Bonilla, Mallory Wilsey, Brendan Henkel, Brian Gross, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.